This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by South by Southwest EDU. EWA retains full editorial control over the content of this podcast. This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Let's start this week's conversation with a couple of statistics. A third of the nation's public schools are rural, and nationally, nearly 9 million students attend rural schools. That's more than the number of students in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, and the next 75 largest school districts combined. But stories about these students, especially the challenges they face reaching higher education, are too rare. That's what makes new reporting by this week's guest especially welcome. Brian Charles of the Chronicle of Higher Education went to Virginia for a close look at efforts to help Black students in rural Sussex County expand their college horizons. He joins us now. Brian, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
How did the story land on your desk?
So this is one of those situations in which you keep looking around for something and then you bump into something else along the way. I was looking at some of the challenges places have, especially states are having, with getting access to underserved minority communities post the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. And we looked at Virginia and we looked at College Advising Corps because, UVA is a big, flagship institution in the state of Virginia. It's also quite a prestigious public university, but one that doesn't always have the percentage of Black and minority students as is representative in the state or nation. That's a challenge at the UVA. So they had come up with a way to address some of that, not just for UVA, but for the entire state and across the state with VCAC, which is actually an outgrowth of College Advising Corps, which operates in, I think, about almost 24 states. As I was going through that reporting and we were doing that, oftentimes you get pulled into a narrower story in some ways than what you initially imagined, and you see a particular problem that arises in the reporting. And what I saw the minute I got to Sussex was one of those things where I said, well, actually, this is a more specific problem here that would be worth actually talking about.
I want to talk about some of the big takeaways from your story. And then in the second half of our conversation, we're going to talk about how you did the story. What are some of the things that are factoring into a rural student's decision about their future after high school?
Well, there's a couple of things. The first thing is just distance, right? It's not oftentimes not even the big university, even the regular access college, let's say it's a 4 years college, may not be close to where they live. Or they may be in a situation where even the 2-year college might be a distance to go to. There's another thing that economists talk about all the time, which is opportunity cost, right? So what am I giving up to pursue a college education? I may be giving up time that I can earn money with the idea I'll earn more money later, but right now I have to be able to deal with the fact that I'm not going to have money in my pocket immediately or I'm going to be giving up hours of work to attend school. In the case of some of the kids in Sussex, and these are actually the more fortunate students, they have families that have family farms or family businesses. And when I say more fortunate, at least they'll be going into a line of work that will pay them a living wage. And they just get pulled into going to work as opposed to going to college.
What I thought you did a good job of in your story is making it clear that there's definitely value in those choices and staying on the family farm, the example you just gave, or staying in the small town where you live. And that a lot of these programs and initiatives, like the outreach that you described from UVA, is about offering students at least some options for another kind of life if they want it. And then how do we give them the tools to get there?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that you're trying to do with a program like that, because think about that program is similar to something like 50 years ago, Peace Corps, and then more recently AmeriCorps. It's actually an AmeriCorps program. That's what BCAC is. It's part of AmeriCorps. Is the idea of putting young people who may have similar experiences to you and giving you access to them, putting them in your face so you can say, well, wait a second. This thing that I'm thinking about, yeah, my family's got this great operation over here, this business, this farm, whatever's going on, and I can go and do that. But I thought about doing this other thing, being a teacher or something like that, but I don't know how to get there. That's the other thing, right? I don't know necessarily what that looks like. Nobody in my family is going to college. In some cases with these kids, some people in their family haven't graduated high school. So for a lot of them, it's just not knowing how to navigate that system. And there's a particular set of skills that we don't often think about when we talk about, pursuing higher education. That's about knowing the skills to actually navigate the system. And so many people, we often refer to them as first gen students in higher ed, don't have the skill sets to navigate that system. And rural students are often, they're not just the first generation to go to college. In some cases, like I said, they're the first generations to get through high school.
I want to talk for a moment about Jontel Elmstead, and she's a crucial piece of your story, and she's crucial to the Sussex student community. Can you tell us about her?
So Chantel is a young woman who did go to UVA. She did get to attend there. She grew up initially in Maryland, had some family issues. Don't want to give away the entire story. I would love people to read it. Had some issues with her family and had to go move in with some extended family members to finish up her high school. Quite a bit of a high achiever. Got great grades in high school. Got a scholarship through her job that she worked at Chick-fil-A, and then was trying to figure out how to go to school. She's not a kid from rural Virginia, but she had a similar problem. And I noticed that right away when I did my initial interviews, which helped to narrow the reporting to some degree, is that she had this issue around distance. Her family, and specifically her grandfather, did not want her going further than an hour away to school for transportation reasons. And also a little bit of, I think, concern about her going away too far. So that kind of definitely limited her choices. But she was fortunate enough is that University of Virginia was exactly an hour away. And then she decided she was going to apply there and try to get into school there. She was discouraged by some folks at her school, saying that she wasn't actually UVA material. She still applied. She still tried to get in. She got in. She had to pull some teeth with family members about helping with the financial aspects of going to school. There's some other stuff that didn't actually make the story, that she had some other financial troubles while she was in school that she was able to overcome. We couldn't fit all that in. And then she didn't have a lot of support for college. She had what a lot of the students she helps out, she had some of those same problems. They're not from the same parts of America. She's not from the rural South. They're not from some of the same demographic backgrounds. Chantel's family largely is pretty middle class, but they still had some of the same struggles. And I could see those two themes working together.
There are certainly some commonalities between her experiences, but there are also some commonalities in how she thrived, the supports that she managed to cobble together for herself. I mean, some of these are just the common sense things that we know students need. Some of them get it automatically from family or other support, and others have to go out and find it, or, hopefully there's an organization that can step up. What are some of the specific challenges, though, for Black rural students that might be different, for example, from a student coming from a white majority high school, maybe in another rural state?
One of the first things is that, and this is what I was hoping to do when we decided to narrow it down to Sussex, is what we were going to talk about, and we knew it was a Black majority school, is that Black rural students have been kind of made invisible to some degree. We don't think of rural America as being having a lot of African American folks in there. Like, we forget that 58% of African Americans live in the South, and that large tracts of the South are rural. So there's going to be Black folks there. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, for a lot of these students, they've lived in either all Black environments, or they're in a rural setting which they may be the only Black person or a handful of Black people. What they have largely not been exposed to is Latinx folks, Asian folks, Pacific Islanders. So sometimes when they go to a big college, what they're being exposed to is their first time seeing kind of like broad spectrum diversity. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's a lot of assumptions that we make about rural folks, right? Like, we have this assumption that culturally they're backwards or sometimes not as smart, and they have to overcome those challenges too, right? They have television like everybody else, and they the clothes that their same age peers like. But sometimes I think we have these kind of like stereotypes about them that they have to overcome. So those are the things that they're dealing with often when they arrive at a four-year institution, especially if they go away to school. And maybe sometimes when they even go to a two-year college, they may be arriving with these packed-in kind of expectations from the people who are their peers or even some faculty members.
We know that rural students often have less access to things like advanced placement classes. We know that staffing shortages can be particularly keen in rural schools. And you saw that at Sussex. Armstead was stepping in to help students with college essays, something that perhaps an English teacher might have done, but that simply wasn't available to them.
Yeah, she actually had to come in her first year and help the children with their essays because there was no English 12 teacher. Places like Sussex have a hard time recruiting in the sense that, when I said it in the story, I say it's in the middle of a swamp, and that's like not an exaggeration. It is in the middle of a swamp. And so it's very difficult to get teachers to say, hey, I want to come in and work in Sussex. Quite a few of them don't live in Sussex, but the closest large town is Petersburg, right, which has its own like kind of issues and economic headwinds it is faced. So you may not go to a place like that to work. So urban schools often deal with this, but the thing is that one thing about urban schools is they are in cities. So because people have lived and clustered around cities, there still is an available workforce. This is just a smaller available workforce that's local, and then it's really hard to attract people in. So that's part of the reason why VCAC is putting folks into these places because they're saying, hey, these are the places where we don't normally see kids leaving there and going off to college. We need to put somebody in there with a college degree, get this funded to pay them a salary for the 2 years. And I think they're extending it now to make a third year optional for some of these some of these young people to work in VCAC and then give these kids exposure to that. Because, yeah, there's often times where they're short staffed. Sussex, to be clear, was not short staffed on counselors. But the thing about it is having the additional counselor just to deal with college took a bit of a load off of the other counselors who may be dealing with all types of home problems that students rural, suburban, and urban all have.
Well, one thing we know is that having a counselor means having a counselor that's effective and knows how to work the system because there are rules to this, right? I mean, and there are also tricks and backdoors and relationships that build that may get a student an interview or get their application a closer look based on some of those adult relationships.
Yeah, that's interesting. That actually goes to the story that I did before I did this story, which was about early decision and early access and people eliminating that and because it created an unfair advantage. But the problem with that is that the counselors who know and they know how to write the right kind of letters to get their students looked at versus the counselors who don't know. So it's a matter of just being in on the information.
We're talking with Brian Charles of the Chronicle of Higher Education about covering rural Black students and their efforts to reach higher education. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. Many thanks to everyone who's taken a moment to rate us on the iTunes podcast library. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. This episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by South by Southwest EDU. Join them March 4th through 7th, 2024 in Austin, Texas, as they tackle the world's most critical social issues through the lens of education. Experience community-driven programming, unparalleled networking opportunities, and unexpected discoveries. Visit southbysouthwestedu.com to discover hundreds of sessions and events already revealed featuring inspiring thought leaders in education. Register today. Brian, you previously covered urban affairs and gun violence before joining the Chronicle. I'm wondering, how familiar were you with rural communities when you began reporting this story?
So here's the one little thing that's very interesting. My first paid newspaper job was at a paper in Big Bear Lake, California, which has a ski resort, actually two of them, but largely is a rural community. I mean, people live on ranches, and there's only sidewalks in downtown, and then once you get out of that, you can kind of get these roads. There's a lot of dirt roads in certain sections. And so the school there is a school that's in a rural community, and the kind of levels of like poverty and kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch would be similar to something you would expect to see in an impoverished inner city neighborhood. Oh, yet those kids also went to school next to, because there was no private school option. Those kids went to school next to people whose parents lived, in huge mansions because they had something to do with the ski industry, or they were independently wealthy. But I was familiar with the idea of having these choices that pull you towards away from college and also being isolated. The closest community college was at least an hour away and sometimes not reachable because of because it snows up in the mountains. And so I was familiar with the idea that there were these rural kids that didn't get access.
You describe Sussex County and the school surrounding this high school, and the only word I could think of for your language really, Brian, is lyrical. I mean, it's beautiful. You talk about the land is lush, and in the breaks between the tall strands of pines are rows of peanut plants and soybeans. The almost monochromatic landscape of green is broken up by the occasional tan of a mature cornfield and the brown and white of a cotton field. I could see it. As clearly as a photograph, I could see that. I just wanted to congratulate you on that beautiful writing.
Oh, thank you. I want to thank my editors for helping me with that, just making sure I didn't go too wax too poetically. So I wanted to say that Dan Barrett was my editor on this.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm a Carol Burnett, a longtime treasured EWA member, and as we don't often get a chance to give shout outs to editors, so shout out right there. But I'm wondering how intentional that was. I mean, thinking about who your readers are and the fact that there is a dearth of stories and coverage on rural students.
One of the things that we early realized is so I want to say that VCAC had given us the idea that we could look at a bunch of schools, and one of the things was is that Joy Pugh at VCAC, I want to definitely give her a lot of credit. Was so we have this rural school where there's this young woman who's amazing, and I think you should talk to her. And I said, okay, we'll see what happens here. I don't know. I was going to go to Petersburg and another school and do three schools and try to figure out what this access issue was. And once I spoke to Chantel, I was like, okay, something else is going on here. And I actually went down to the area. What's kind of interesting is I have family from around this area on both the Virginia and North Carolina side, so I'm very familiar with the area. When I realized that there was this kind of rural setting, I realized a couple things. Both Chantel's story was about time and distance, and what was, and when I realized where I was like, oh, there's time and distance. It's hard to get from here to there. And one of the things that's not really in the story that's kind of a thing that I think about was is that they centralized all the schools in Sussex. And that was good for buses to get the kids there, but it made it hard for parents to get to school events because they used to have schools in their neighborhood. And I kept thinking, this is all about time and distance. This is all about time and distance. So I needed to figure out how this place looks so much different than other places that our readers knew. And that's in this middle of a place that's not where you're going to see a lot of colleges, although Richard Bland College is not far from there, which is where a lot of the kids go. Um, and I'm like, it's all about time and distance. And I need to kind of set up this otherworldliness of the fact that this place is a little bit different than what a lot of our readers, especially us being a publication that's read by a lot of people in higher education, that's not the world that they see all the time.
Did you hit any roadblocks in your reporting? I'd love to hear how you overcame them. I'm wondering if there was any pushback to access or concerns from families.
It's very interesting. A lot of times is that you finish reporting and then people start to have their own concerns about this. And there were some concerns raised by folks at Sussex about how they were going to be depicted. That was something that I kind of worked through VCAC and University of Virginia with, just to kind of say, hey, this is what the story is going to look like. I am a big proponent of when you're doing stories like this that I said there are no surprises. Now, I'm not going to let you go change my story, or I'm not going to read the entire story to you, but I'm going to go say, hey, this is what we're going to try to do in the story. And oftentimes, or how do you feel about that? Sometimes that can actually get you actually a little bit of more information to contextualize things that you're talking about in the story, but I don't do surprises with people. They're not going to read something in a publication and go, well, where the heck did he get that from? Because we're going to talk through that. But there was a little bit of hesitancy post the initial reporting about how people were going to be depicted, because it is a sensitive situation to talk about, a 24-year-old young woman's family history. There is a sensitivity with talking about people who are being left behind or not getting to the educational, milestones that other people are getting to, and you worry about the fact of being painted like a cartoon character. We wanted to make sure, for example, when we did the illustration on our website, this also, I think it's in print too, that we didn't put like the kid making the choice between the university and the farm. People will see this when they go to the website. You don't want to put them in overalls and a hat, because then we're actually just doing a little too much. We wanted to make sure we were saying, these kids are just normal kids. They just happen to have a business that means that they work on a farm. And that's what we wanted to get across.
You provide some data points in your story that I think are really useful, both for contextualizing John Tell's experiences, but also William Bowers, one of the students you profile at Sussex. And I'm wondering, for the reporters who are listening, what are some of the sources you found most helpful or useful for this story? Are there some people that they should think about talking with?
UVA initially was very helpful, gave them a lot of stuff up front. I did that. That's one of those things you could do a public records request for. But the easier way before you start filing official public records requests is to try to go through the front door and ask. In this case, I did, and they gave me that stuff. National Center for Education Statistics. I want to thank our data editor, Audrey June, for actually helping me to cull that together for me. That gave us the information about the free and reduced lunch price numbers. We used state of Virginia's information on the school level data, right? So that's how we figured out, graduation rates and how many people were going off to college. The Census Bureau was a place that we went to. We used the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity to look at what the return on investment for a degree was, and then some research from Georgetown Center on Education and Workforce for some of the same thing about what a degree pays across your life. What we wanted to try to do is, again, like the kind of main theme here is time and distance. And that gets us into like kind of the economic idea of like opportunity costs. Like, yes, right now the opportunity cost between 18 and 22 of going to college is very high, but it may pay off when you're 40 or 42, right? The thing about it is it's very hard for a kid at 18 to see 40. It's very hard for somebody at 32 to see 42, but let alone someone at 18. So again, it was all about time and distance. And I think what we were trying to get to is just that, what that looked like as far as going to college, not going to college, but also going to college out of a place where the distance and the time to school is very far away.
And also there's the philosophical distance, right? I mean, between what a student might think they want or envision for their lives and what their families may be expecting or hoping for them, and it may be very, very different. That chasm can be significant.
Yeah, it was. You could see it with kids. Like you had kids that had like had utility bills in their name, and they're like 17. Because their parents, had run into financial problems. You had one kid that we spoke to, that we talked about in the story, that the principal had told me the story, in which the young lady just wanted to make money, and she didn't know what that was. She just knew she wanted it, right? She didn't think college or whatever. So a young person in that situation is one that may be looking for the quickest route to something. And then there's the philosophical difference of thinking like, well, you're stupid for going to college because all they can see in the immediate, their family is, there's all this debt you're taking on. And you're taking on this debt to come back here or go somewhere else and maybe make slightly more, or in some cases make less than that's hung around here and got a job at Smithfield. And why did you do that? Not knowing that, what's going to happen is that person most likely, statistically speaking, is going to kind of surpass the other person in earnings and make back the difference of what their degree cost them, over the course of their lifetime. That's some of the philosophical differences, So, and also there's just not a lot of people in places like Sussex that hold college degrees. That's just something we found, that in Sussex County, it's like 13% of the adults over 25 hold a college degree. So there's no one to look at and go, well, there's not just no one. There's very few people to look at and go, well, it worked out for that person. And that becomes difficult.
Are there a couple of story ideas for local reporters who may want to follow your lead and look more closely at students of color living in rural communities?
I mean, I think one of the things that I would look at, that we didn't want to get too narrow in this, because then it's a different story, is one of the things that we have is there's just a little bit of a throwaway line in here, which is about like the fact that the kids are jumping over each other to get into the welding classes. One of the things that you're seeing in higher ed is the ability to allow young adults to stack certificates, right? Certifications, so they can do that to get jobs right away and not necessarily looking at the place where they need to be, just getting a bachelor's degree in this or a master's degree in that they can have something that's a little more usable in the short term. Community colleges have long been pretty good at this, and now even some of the four-year schools are getting onto this. I think looking at the way that in rural communities, it's about getting something quick, like doing a 6 month or 1 year program that you can do while you're working to go get the things that you need. Especially as like some of these work opportunities are being spread across different parts of the country, they're looking for trained workforce. But what happens is that people have to be ready for those things as they arrive. And what they may need something where they're ready for that within a year, and what's being done to accommodate that. One of the things that Principal Pierce talked about was whether their career and technical education was sufficient enough. And I didn't get to look into that, but that's another question in Sussex County specifically, and that may be a question in other rural counties. So I think that to look at where everything from mid-career to basic career and technical training and in kind of certificate stacking, that's something that I would definitely think that a local reporter in one of these rural communities should be looking at, because that's probably the sweet spot for so many of these young people.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you before we send them out to do those stories, is there something they should have in mind, be thinking about avoiding in terms of tropes about rural students or communities or misconceptions you'd like to warn them against?
Well, yeah, first of all, any idea that folks are less educated or dumb or less ambitious, just get that out of your head right away. That's the first thing. The second thing is do a lot more listening, because there's a lot there. Part of what I did, I was only all that reporting that you see in that story is really centered, or not all of it happened in a single day, obviously, but most of it's centered around a single day, as people can follow in the story. That day was just me listening to people tell me their stories about what they had gone through. We ran into William by accident, for example. And so going through that over and over and over again was really, watching them talk about these same things really nailed it for me and really solidified the fact that, oh, I see what the themes are here. And I think if you kind of are patient with it, the story will come to you more than you will try to figure out how to jerry rig a story to make it fit on this backdrop of rural America. The stories are right there for the picking.
Brian Charles is a senior reporter at the Chronicle for Higher Education, covering the intersection of race and higher education. Before joining the Chronicle, he helped to relaunch Baltimore Beat, a Black-run newspaper, and served as its deputy editor. He's also been a staff writer at The Trace and was a staff writer for the Governing magazine covering urban affairs. He joined us from his office in Baltimore. Brian, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you very much. And we'll figure out who's going to go out to EWA this year. I enjoyed your conference last year. Maybe I'll get out again this year.
We would love to see you. And listeners, we'd love to see you there as well. Brian and I will be waiting in the lobby of the Mirage Hotel to welcome you. And we will be in Las Vegas. That will be May 29th through June 2nd. 2024. All the information currently on the EWA website. Brian, thanks again.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.